Welcome to a special episode of Natural Recovery from Suffering. This is actually a precursor to the one that should be coming out Monday called All Your Suffering is Connected to One Thing. Okay, so in other words, let's talk about something first. If you're going to listen to that, hopefully you will. Listen to them back to back, like this one and then the one coming out on Monday. This Monday, it's called All Your Suffering is Connected to One Thing. A critique of presence practices and, in parentheses, teachings is in order. We have to. Because here's the reason why I'm trying to explain this. I'm never someone who would want to take such an adversarial position towards something. It's not an adversarial position, but it's like listen, if you're not careful, I'm trying to explain it. If you're not careful, you get lulled into a body unconsciousness that, and certain benefits come from that, but then the deep repression stays. And that comes from long-term meditation, long-term inquiry practice, or even being exposed to non-dual teachings or certain traditions for a while. I've seen people, and I want to talk about the root of suffering on Monday. So now I want to talk about how we miss it today in presence practices. Forget the practices. In presence, we miss it. What do we miss? That's just it. It's what's missing. It's what's missing. No wonder we miss it. Emotional repression, what we've buried, is what's missing. So, it's missing here in the moment because everything happens here. Nothing happens outside of presence, as we say. It's happening here. In other words, it's missing here, is what I mean. And that's, of course, why I missed it, because every one of my books are about be with what arises. But not, how do you be with what's missing? Oh, well, a feeling that something is missing arises, right? A feeling of lack or a sense of lack or deficiency. Yes. Or even a very strong sense of it. Like there's something wrong with me or you or whatever, or something missing. That we can allow. So we say. But if you notice, that feeling is a very deeply felt feeling in the body. Just right here in the now. I want you to come down and just feel. Like right now, if we get really quiet, we might not feel it, just might say, well, that's my body. But see, that's right, because we buried certain emotions there in the so-called body. And so when we talk about the now, or presence, we have to include, quote unquote, the body. But here's where it gets interesting, is if you just come down and feel the body, guess what? The repression is missing. It's repressed and it doesn't arise to awareness. You see how my bypass kept happening and why I kept suffering chronic pain, which led to suicidal ideation and other things, even after my shift, is because I didn't get to the root of suffering. That was missing. And it was producing everything that was arising to awareness, or everything that I was conscious of at any given stage in my life. So if I go back and tell you that the now looked different, just like with you, at different stages of my life. Briefly, when I was 20, it looked like I was about ready to go to college, but I was afraid to really be myself. I was self-conscious, and I was starting to use drugs, and I was really starting to suffer internally more. And that was all the now, it was the now, but That was my presence. It was very unconscious, and repression was driving that. Just like the science says, driving the addiction, driving whatever depression was there with it, driving the chronic pain that had started, driving, I don't feel comfortable with myself, self-consciousness, because if I hold my anger back, then I don't know who I am. I'm presenting as somebody that I'm not. So of course I'm looking for myself, and I'm conscious of myself because I can't be myself. It's all repression. But that was mine now. If I move forward 10 years later, just a lot of drug addiction, heavy, heavy drug addiction and suffering. That was mine now, and that was driven by trauma and repression. If I go to being in the 12-step years, no drugs and alcohol, many years of sobriety, and mine now was a sober now. But I was still suffering because the repression that was missing was still there. The suffering continued. As a teacher, the now was finally recognized. See, all of that up until that, well, when the shift happened, I was in that unconscious sense of separation, consciousness, so to speak, and like where that's what I am. But the shift showed me that's not what I am. I'm the awakeness fundamentally, or you are too. We all are. And that was the first time, of course, that the now was recognized as what I am. And of course, the initial, as I've shared, the initial recognition was I'm also the street lamp, the bed, the couch, the lotion bottle, and the carpet, and everything else. And so are you. There's no separation. In other words, seen, thought it was done. That makes me laugh because it's a thought, really. But the embodiment hadn't happened. And so there again, the now, the repression was there too. It was just buried in the experience, or as soon as the experience or the shift, all the byproducts, after it took a while, I actually had very deep realization, but some of the byproducts started to die out after about 1.5, 2 years. And then it's just peace and presence. And the sense of non-separation was still there, but the joy and the energetic aspect of it had been slowly dimming the whole time until it was like much quieter. And that was my now during those years, and that was also repression. As the repression was coming up, the chronic pain was getting worse. The byproducts of awakening had kind of died down as the trauma was coming to the surface. See, it's all repression. So at any given point, if I say the now, even as I first came to non-dual teachings before being a teacher, I love these stories because I have great fond memories of like sitting with Eckhart DVDs, the days when you had DVDs. Remember those days? And feeling that just being in his presence, the now, and feeling that as my own presence. That's what I am. And then right there, then I would get up and then I would suffer because the anger and other repression and trauma wasn't dealt with in that now moment though. And as I sat with him and he didn't get to the repression, then I didn't either when I left those DVDs or other teachers or whatever. And it was just always driven by something that was missing. All that suffering in the now. Stay tuned for more of the now. With the anger and other repression missing, from the beginning of my exposure to Eastern practices and teachings, just if you look at my case study, which I'm not unlike a lot of people, they just may not know it. The repression was missing, and so when I would sit with teachers or sit in meditation or rest as awareness, my system desperately sought peace, first of all, because of the buried anger that was driving all my suffering. But I wasn't going to relieve that suffering by feeling and expressing anger or learning to process it because it was buried. It was missing, and I would attribute the word It's the missing experience to Serena. She's one of our trainers. But yeah, it was missing. There was no way I was going to process that. So, but I felt that sense of separation and deficiency and lack that came from it, though. That was right above it, or you could say produced by it, but still the anger repression was unconscious in that. If you can understand, you can't feel the anger, or you can't feel the buried hurt or buried sadness. You can't feel it. It's buried. But the programming that you are angry or hurt or sad is there, buried in the body, along with programming that says you can't express it. It's all there. But it's inaccessible by just doing nothing but being. Even if you sat quietly and listened to the inner body, repression doesn't arise to awareness. That's just something that you can't really learn. I mean, you can learn it first, and that can help you, but you can't really learn it just by sitting and being, because it's never going to arise unless you learn it by the fact that it never arises. But how would you know to look for it if it's repressed in the first place? Until I went to science and, Dr. Sarno's books, I didn't know to look, actually. And they didn't tell me how to look. I had to develop that for myself. But so how do I critique practices and even teachings like mine and others without talking about that? Without saying, well, the very root of my suffering and all of ours, according to science, this repression doesn't arise to awareness. And what we're really in the business of mostly is being with what arises to awareness. And then at the very base level, we feel that sense of separation in the so-called body and a sense of deficiency. But do we know where that really, really comes from, or what creates that? The deficiency is an emotional deficiency. It's the buried anger, hurt, or sadness. We're missing those emotions. That's why our body feels that way. That's why we feel that way. But because those emotions are buried, we don't know that that's why we feel that way. And so the mind gets involved and says, I'm not good enough, or I'm lacking, or I'm, you see what I mean, inadequate. It's trying to express something that is unconscious. It's buried emotions. We're deficient in that, and we've unprocessed fear too of those emotions, of course. Frozen fear. Frozen fear just means old emotion that we never processed, and it's your body now. It's your sense of separation right here in the now, and what you call body, and the sense of lack or deficiency if you have that sensation or sensations. And then, see, this is all the now. So we just point to the now as if it doesn't have this stuff. Then we blind ourselves to the root of suffering, and then here it keeps coming into awareness. And if we just point to the awareness and say, be with what arises to awareness, then what are we looking at there, at what arises? And then now. If you sit quietly, see what arises. Just notice thoughts, feelings that go with them. Let them be as they are. Notice that you're noticing from awareness, so to speak. You're just being with that as it is. See for yourself. It's always the now. So what's arising now? What was arising in the now before now, earlier today when you weren't just sitting here? What was arising yesterday, last week? Suffering. You can call it something else, but that's all relevant. That's all the now. And just sit with that for a moment and just notice that when we say just be here and now, if we don't go any deeper than that, we're just saying be here. Like I was saying, it's like the John Lennon song. I'm just sitting here watching my suffering come and go. Instead of I'm sitting here watching the wheels go round and round. But it's the same kind of premise. I'm just sitting here. Things are coming and going to awareness. Some sensations, though, don't seem to really go, if you notice. Can you trust that? And what does that mean anyway? Can you trust that they don't leave for a reason? It's hard to, because when we tell you just to be here now, it's always the now, and then therefore you're just being with the sensation constantly, whatever that is. You know that stomach sensation, as you feel it, or the chronic pain or something. Some sensations seem to always be there, or frequently, if you notice, or some symptoms or anxiety, something. And that's important in the now, because these things that persist, we're being told, for example, and I told people, just let all that be. Just notice it. You don't really let it be. You just stop trying to fix, change, allow, dissolve, get rid of what's arising, because that actually doesn't make any sense. That's Dzogchen wisdom and many other traditions. But from a trauma perspective, it makes sense to, at the very least, be with, allow what arises, because at the unconscious level, we create the suffering. We have the conditioning that says we want these stories there to keep us safe from the buried stuff. And that's all unconscious. So, of course, if these things come into awareness that are created by the repression, as science says, as you can find in your own body, though, then we want to allow it if it comes into awareness. That's anything else that doesn't make any sense. If I sit here and try to change it, I'm changing something that I created. If I try to dissolve it, okay, I'm trying to dissolve something that I created. If I try to resist, if I resist it, I'm resisting my own creation. But see, the thing is we're unconscious to that part, that we're creating it. At first, until we become increasingly conscious of that, and then of course the suffering goes away, because the suffering gets created only in that consciousness that can't see it. See how that works? Only in the unconsciousness does it work. In other words, does the suffering continue? In being not conscious of the buried stuff that creates that is connected directly to it. We can't see that here in the now. By just being here now. That's my criticism. The root of suffering doesn't arise to awareness. The mind-body connections, like I'm angry, but I can't express it. There's conditioning like that that's buried for anger repressors, and it's so buried. And there are emotions with that too. And that's all fear. It's a fear of anger. There's fear there. And then there's, for sadness repressors, I'm sad. Or words of that effect that identify someone who's sad. They're just words, but they're connected to buried sadness. And with conditioning that says I can't express that in so many words. It's a trauma response. But if those remain unconscious along with buried hurt, or any of those, then those produce false identity on the surface here in the now. So we're not aware of the repression, though. That's buried, the buried hurt, sadness, anger. So what we notice is what comes into awareness. If we're even in an awareness practice or in a meditative way of being, if we're just really, really unconscious out there in the world, that's different. But here, I invite people to just notice what arises, of course, and let that be, because that's the only thing that makes sense, right? Trying to get rid of what we create doesn't really. But if we simply include here in the now what needs to be included, which is the buried stuff and the programming with it, then we have the now embodied, you could say. But it's really just the now. We're conscious. Throughout the so-called body, we're not coming from the repression, not suffering. That's the root of suffering for a lot of us. Read the science first. There's a slew of studies that I've said this Monday. I'll say it again so you guys see it. I'm not just talking. You can find this in your body with the test that I give you at the end here. But and read the science too if you need to. It's on my Instagram profile, and I posted it on, I think, on Facebook. Certainly in the members area. But if you can see that, then it just educates you about something that you can't be aware of directly in the now, in presence. As presence, you can't be aware of it directly because it's hidden. And it really does answer all the unprocessed stuff that happens, or this is the stuff that happens in people's lives, the suffering, including with us teachers getting sick. And it's really the root of suffering for a lot of us, but we're blind to it. It's missing. It's what's missing. So we tell our stories at the surface, and then we say, allow the stories. But if we would look deeper into the body, we would see why the stories are there, and the suffering, and the chronic pain, and all that. That's safer than feeling and expressing anger to our loved ones, or hurt, or sadness. I actually discovered that it's safer to get cancer, or to the extent my cancer was caused by that. I know my spinal stenosis for sure was, because the chronic pain, nerve pain, got healed from that. I know that. Because that's direct experience. I don't know it in my mind. But see, the now includes something that we don't want to include. I guess that's my point. I was going to tell you more about that. That's what I want to say. The now includes more than we want to include. There's an aspect of the now that we're actually running from. You could say there's no people running, but it's programming that doesn't want to feel and express these buried emotions. So in a sense, it creates a future where it's like we're running or trying to escape. And that future helps us escape the prospect of feeling, expressing that, and being authentic and no longer suffering. The seeking, of course, is not the way to end the suffering. But it can show us that it's coming from the same emotional repression and trauma and buried in the body, same thing, same programming, running that. And that's how I wanted to do this critique, is not to go out there and pick on teachers. I don't have any anger for those teachers or anybody doing meditation or mindfulness. It's just like I wanted somebody to pull me aside and say these things. So I'm going to spin this last segment as if I'm pulling you aside and I'm telling you a few things that nobody ever said to me that will hopefully prepare you to listen Monday. If you haven't already started the 3DKI work, hopefully these 2 podcasts will help with that. Stay tuned. If I pulled you aside, as I'm doing that right now, if you were starting presence practices or listening to teachings, I would say, well, this is what this is pointing to that same presence. But the now includes and has always included more than we are conscious of and can be conscious of by even being aware now. Being the awareness, because this repression is running the suffering, this trauma. It only can do that by being buried, by being the missing experience. So I would take you back and I would talk about my life So I'm doing right now and yours, and I would point you to parts of your life where you would resonate, and I would say, well, when I was a kid, I buried anger. I'd pull you aside and we would discover what you buried first. But then I would say, look, I buried anger. So I showed up as a good kid on the surface. That's what was visible. That wasn't missing. That was here. Have to be good. Had to be peaceful. Had to be quiet. I suffered quietly. I didn't get angry as a kid. I also didn't express, after being bullied, other parts of myself. All that remained unconscious. I didn't know I was angry. I had buried that early. That's how I developed into who I thought I was. Other parts were more suppressed. I was more aware of them, but they were also repressed from the beginning, like homosexuality in the beginning, of course, or whenever, and then just gender, femininity. These are the things that were missing for me. And these are also the things that were responsible for the suffering that I was aware of when you talk about the now. And when people come to these teachings or practices, I'll say, you have a certain level, so to speak, of consciousness right now. You may not be aware of how you are this awareness, that this is what you are. You're the very consciousness, that we're pointing to, very awakeness. You may not know that, but you have some awareness, even in some state of unconsciousness, that, for example, at the surface you experience suffering. And that you have all your life, just like me. So if you go back to your childhood, by being a good boy or girl, or being whatever you were, there was suffering in it. Whatever your conditioning was, mine was that, what was yours, you may not be aware of some of it, much of it actually, because it's tied to repression. How could you be? Unless you do this work. But if you go back to childhood, these are things that we don't particularly remember. I mean, I don't remember I was burying anger. So the thing about repression is that it happens below our level of detectable awareness. We don't know that we're burying these emotions. If we're aware that we're having an emotion and that we suppress it, that's different. That's like suppression, but that happens too. But if you really, really see this, then the now has always included what we've buried. For all of us, I couldn't have been that peacemaker kid without bearing anger. It was there in every now moment that I was showing up as good or whatever. But it was missing. It was what was missing. And it was driving what I could see, what I was conscious of at any now moment in my life. And you can do the same. Look at your life and see it. But you have to really do the work to become conscious of it. That's different than just understanding what I'm saying. But like, the bullying, same thing. See, after the bullying, I started to really want to blend in. I didn't want to stand out anymore because that's why I got bullied. So again, all those traits that I got bullied for became things that I suppressed or had already repressed. So that became how I showed up in the world. I actually had a feminine quality, a very creative spirit, but I stuffed that down when I was with people. And groups became uncomfortable for me. And I felt self-conscious around people most of the time growing up. That every now moment of my self-consciousness was anger there in those moments, buried. And I just wanted to, this before you, and as you hear this critique, I want you to understand that this is a lifelong thing for us. And we get to the non-dual teachings and practices and we just miss it again. But I want you to understand that we've missed it our whole lives. That this is how we've suffered, by missing it. When I came out of the closet in age 21, 2, to my parents and to other people, I couldn't, when I would hang around other gay men, they were more feminine than me back then. And I didn't understand that. But then, well, I would get laid out of that, as I would say. That's sort of crude to say, but in other words, some guys like that. They liked it. But I didn't understand why I was called more straight acting gay guy, but that was my repression. Identity comes from repression. How you show up comes from what you bury. I have to hold back what's true for me, and so there was femininity in me that was quite natural and a creativity that I had suppressed. And these men who could express their femininity were a mirror for me, but I couldn't see it. And that's because the femininity was missing. And I've told the story just recently on this podcast, so I want to tie it all together for you guys. So you can tie it in your life. It's all about your freedom. But it's also about us being open and honest, because this is beautiful to see that we've all suffered and why we did and how we missed the root of it. And we can all share about it. Everybody should have a podcast and do KI, because then we can hear each other for the first time and see what we've been doing, and we've been deceiving each other and ourselves. But if we don't talk about it, the repression and suppression continues. The trauma continues like an unbroken chain here in spirituality, just like in our families. If you can see it in your whole life, when you get here to a presence, practice, or teaching, you can no longer bypass. You don't have to bypass, in other words. You can actually end the suffering if you take that seriously. Look at your life, just like mine. The puzzle pieces may not come together yet, because repression makes us very unconscious and we don't understand why we suffer until we get to the repression level that, where it's created. And then we have insight into where it came from. So when I had the record deal, like I said on the recent podcast episode, offered to me, or the band I was in, which expressed itself in a very androgynous way, but I couldn't, because that part of me was pushed down from being bullied. So here I was, we were creating this very feminine music. My voice was feminine, and that was the voice of the music, but I couldn't express myself in that way, and I sabotaged that record deal. See, on the surface, identity. Below the surface, repression. On the surface, suffering, along with identity. Below the surface, repression, trauma. On the surface, falseness. Below the surface, holding back what's true. Do we become angry people? Am I going to become a woman? No. These are parts of myself. They needed to be included along with everything, but the presence is what I am. I just needed all parts of myself, just like you, so that I could end suffering. But how do you do that when you come to presence teachings and you don't know the root of suffering? So that's why I'm saying, go look at your life first, so you don't continue making the same error when you get here. Once you see it in your life, you may see deficiency stories. I may pull you aside and say, look, these are things you're aware of already. No matter what your state of consciousness is, you probably know on some level, as I said earlier, that you feel deficient, that you feel like insufficient, inadequate, not worthy, or worthless, or worse. That right there is the repression. The sense of deficiency is the emotional deficiency. Something is missing. That's what I've been saying. So you can trust your experience, but it's hard to trust your own body with repression, because the conditioning is trying to push these emotions and things out of your consciousness your whole life. And then it shows up as a separate body and a sense of deficiency. And then we say, be here now, but then all of that conditioning is missing there in the now and doesn't rise to awareness, to presence. It's like the man behind the curtain. And then everything you see is the effects of that. That's what the science is saying. It's an emotional issue that is a big part, along with genetics, environment, and other things. But the emotional issue has to be included. Trauma is a major player in that, according to the science. And then once you see it, then every now moment then includes the unconscious in KI. Meaning, does that mean you go around and you're aware of every impulse of your... No. What it means is you're in a practice that's transmuting the very repression that creates your suffering. That's what the practice is. So then when the suffering arises, you trace it back to the root, right there. And it's hard to understand it. That's why I'm trying to take it slow for people who haven't done it, of why that's maybe the option that you want to take. I think I gave you the options of like you either rest and allow it, you process it, you resist it, whatever. But why would you take the option of, I hope I explained that well. Why would you take the option of inquire when suffering arises, but go to the root, the repression? Because your consciousness and mind too, before I did this work, is created in such a way that you don't see the connection. So it's like I had chronic pain for 28 years and 10 years as a teacher and could not see and was not conscious of the anger that created that anger repression. So you have to kind of start understanding that this is something that's missing. And this is the one thing that all of our suffering is connected to, is like I say on Monday. But many of us are in presence practices around presence teachings, including my old teaching, that we've been programmed not to be able to see this because of some of the teachings and practices. That's my criticism. That it's the same criticism, as I said, of Ken Wilber and others, that we're just missing the root. And if you can understand that I criticize my own practice and teaching first, to be humble around that, because that's true. I'm one of the teachers. I might not be as well known as other teachers, but still, I put 7 books out there. I have some responsibility in this, to me, to say, okay, I didn't include something in the now, in presence, that needed to be included. And then because of that, I want to teach in a different way. I want to share in a different way. I want to include that now. But why should you, if your consciousness is developed in a way to shut out your chronic pain, the understanding that your chronic pain is connected to repression, or that your body contraction or your shadows or depression or anxiety, even if there's science out there supporting it, your consciousness is developed in a way to make sure you don't see it. And that's the hurdle we're up against here, all of us. That's why I talk so much about it. Good insight leads to that, because it leads people into a new way of inquiry or of seeing, and it's an unconsciousness for people. If you don't talk about it, the pathways that need to be lit up don't light up, and if you don't do the inquiry, the actual experience of the insight doesn't take place. And then that, of course, is part of it. The biggest part of it is doing the work. But why would you do it? See, why would you just go back to the present practice? Why would you go back to things like I was doing, or even people that do it better than what I was doing earlier? Even earlier in the podcast, I mean. Because that regulates your system. See, nobody pulled me aside when I was just sitting there. And I love Eckhart, and I criticize his teaching, but his teaching is rich too. Parts of it are so rich, like no other, like the new earth, the 3 frequencies of being. That I feel that in my whole being when I just hear it and remember that teaching, because acceptance, approval, enthusiasm. But he just provides no pathway to what's in the pain body that creates that we can't experience those states, those deeper states. That's my criticism. But when I would sit with him, his embodied experience. I could feel that more than with some other teachers. But so I didn't understand, and it's not his fault, because I don't think he had anger repression. I don't even know if he had. I think he had an embodiment that was really sudden. I don't think he had to process much. I don't know how much trauma he had, but I just know that as anger repressors, we can sit with people like that and be lulled into, just like you would sit with some of my old teachings and not recognize that we have anger repression. Sorry, Eckhart, I love you. Let's have dinner. I think you're kind of cute. But no, because with those of us with trauma, even if it helps regulate us, that could actually lull us into an unconsciousness around the repression that creates the suffering. So we need to talk about everything that you talk about, Eckhart, and everything that I talk about, and everything that everybody else talks about that makes sense and resonates, but we need to include the pathway to the root of suffering. We don't need to, but why wouldn't we? Because not only is not including it not getting to the root of suffering, but it can actually prolong our suffering. And here's why. It's not any of the teachers doing it. It's not a criticism of any teacher, including Eckhart or even Scott Kiloby. It's the unconsciousness of humans. We can't help it at a certain stage of consciousness or degree of consciousness. We can't help it. Just like Eckhart says, they know not what they do. Or the Bible says that. But, I just wanted to make that point, which is these teachings and pointers are very regulating to the nervous system of people who have trauma, and that trauma is buried. Those are buried emotions. And so when we get really quiet and discover the stillness, these are just sensations that we can easily explain away and rest with and just say that's just a sensation and let it be. And then repression hides in all that. So many of us have had experience of like presence, some degree, and then what? You have a bad knee, or your stomach is really tense, or that you still feel like there's a separate body here, or the sense of deficiency or lack remains, or there's depression, or there's chronic pain. See, we have to pay attention to the now, don't we? Talk about the now. Can we please pay attention to it then? That's what I want to say. And people say, well, you're criticizing the now. No, I'm not criticizing the now. I'll talk about that later. I'm criticizing the teachings that I don't know if we were all paying attention to the now, is what I'm saying. And what's really here? There's a kind of a dark matter here that we could call body. That's what the trauma research calls it. But when we know in the non-dual, in the presence, we don't really feel a separate body as we go deeper into that recognition. But it still could be here. The repression hides in the sensations. Away from our detectable awareness as just that, oh, that's that bad elbow. That's that, oh, I got a bad back. I got a little of a sensation there in the side that stays. Or got acid reflux, or this disease, or anxiety. These things. Can we pay attention to the now, please? That's what I want to say. Because I have great reverence for the non-dual traditions and what they're pointing to. Do not get me wrong with these criticisms, including the podcast, Hey Non-Duality, What Your House is on Fire. The reason that I criticize is because I love these traditions deeply, deep in my heart. The anger that I had buried was dealt with, including around these teachings and around I was doing. I have nothing but forgiveness for the unconsciousness of humans, but let's do something different. How could I criticize the now? That's what we are. We are this awareness. It's not that. It's not even criticism. It's actually more like love. It's like, can we pay attention now to the now? If we really love each other, that we're going to teach and guide and mentor and facilitate and coach, and can we pay attention here to the now? That this dark matter here in the now continues to produce suffering, and that if we point away from it, we're not taking responsibility for the root of suffering that we're carrying around from either this life or the last or generations. And so we might be hanging out in a peaceful sort of state or recognition or whatever, or working towards that, but we're not taking responsibility for the suffering that we're carrying if we just ignore the dark matter or say that's just a sensation. And by the way, it's not happening in any body, just happening in awareness. But why is it happening? Why? Not for the analytical mind, why? Not that kind of why. But why? If you know how to ask your body why, it will tell you. the programming will be produced. We'll show you if you're skillful. And you want to know, because that's not just a sensation. That's my criticism right there. To the teachings that just say that's a sensation appearing to awareness. Everything is something appearing to awareness, damn it. Right? We're always just sitting here watching everything come and go to awareness. To say that sensation itself is just that, well, to say everything is just that, but everything is not just equally that. Because, for example, the color yellow, I don't have a particular problem with as an arising to awareness. Generally. Whenever I see yellow or dogs, I had to grab my dog, Oliver, that I have in my hands now, a little brown, golden brown Chihuahua, that phenomena is not the same as the pain in my spine, which was a sensation. They're all not exactly equal arisings to awareness. And that's part of my criticism, because some of the teachings kind of program me to say, well, it's all just equally arising to awareness. Well, no, it's not. That's not paying attention to the now. Because my dog, Oliver, does not feel anything like nerve pain. I'm holding him right now, I can assure you. All right, stay tuned, because we're going to talk about just how things are not equal in awareness. And if we don't recognize that and pay attention to it, we're going to keep suffering. So we've established, hopefully, that not everything arises and falls to awareness. Even if that seems implied in those teachings, that doesn't match the research or our own bodies if we look with inquiry. So we just dispel these myths. Not everything arises and falls to awareness, and not all the teachings are saying that. Only the ones that are or are implying it in some way. And then that we don't look for the root of suffering if we think that. But then when everything, or whatever thing that is arising to awareness, if it's implied that it's all equal in some way, because it's not really. Oliver, that I have in my hands right now, is again not the same as that nerve pain was. They feel different, they look different, they are different. Different stories with them. Not a lot of stories at all with Oliver. There were some with the pain. Different. And again, the teachings didn't mean to always imply that I should treat everything equally. They were trying to help me allow everything. But you can't allow nerve pain in the way that you would allow an Oliver. But sometimes it's implied that you can do that. And if you look, you really can't. I mean, when we're just sitting and allowing pain, for example, what feels like pain and presence, unconsciously there's conditioning that's holding on to anger, hurt, or sadness. And it doesn't want that pain or contraction to go away. You're holding on to it for dear life. But on the surface, it just looks like, well, just allowing it like we're allowing Oliver. I'm just sitting and allowing the pain or the contraction or my body. But at the unconscious level, there's a whole bunch of activity that says, no, you can't feel and express that. You can't be that. You can't be that. And that creates all the suffering that we do notice, including the pain or the contraction or the nerve pain or whatever. Stories, identities, shadows. So we have to actually be with some phenomena very differently, or be with phenomena differently. Because if I sit here and allow the pain like I allow Oliver and sort of treat those equally, then I just blind myself to the fact that the phenomena of nerve pain contains the root of my suffering and Oliver doesn't. He helps me get away from that. He was always a good nervous system regulator during my pain healing process. I'm sure you know what I mean if you have a dog or a cat or 12. There's just nothing better than like if I just stirred up a bunch of stuff and it's just starting to settle down. I just grab Oliver. That was before I knew better, because you want to really allow stuff. But, you know, point taken, right? Hopefully, that not everything is equal and everything shouldn't be treated equally. And we've already talked about all of our options, and we don't want to just allow everything anyway, because, well, because we're just allowing what we create, the suffering we create. That's not the same as holding Oliver. I didn't create. There's no suffering with Oliver. But with suffering, I create that. So I don't want to just allow that if I'm creating it. I do want to process it. But I can't do that unless I'm open to getting out of a certain framework that I might be in with meditation or mindfulness or certain forms of inquiry, where I'm just not going to look in certain ways in certain places. For whatever reasons, I have my belief systems around that, like, or maybe I've been trained to only process a certain way. But once you understand that the option of processing, but then getting to the root, is the option that you want, then you have to contend with the fact that it's missing. So every time you go to process, you're going to want to go to something else. And here's the bypass right here. And this is, of course, part of my criticism. I've been criticizing for years that the non-dual bypass, or the Eastern practice bypass, is so innocent. Nobody's doing anything wrong. This criticism is just talking about people and our unconsciousness. It's not even putting the blame on someone, but someone out there right now will have unprocessed stuff around this and say, damn it, I wish he would stop criticizing people. And I'll say, that's because you bury anger, probably. But I'm not criticizing people. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying this is our unconsciousness. Don't you want to be free? It's all included. Because this is how I missed it, you guys. Because nobody would pull me aside or scream and holler at the top of any rooftop that this stuff is going on, that we can't see it. Nobody would do it. I'm willing to take some blows if people don't like that. Totally willing. Because nobody did that for me. So the bypass is like this. It's that, first of all, usually, in many cases, we're not even prompting things up. Sometimes it's just first dimension, right? As we call it here, first dimension practice means just being with what is and then not prompting anything up. And therefore, because we're not prompting anything up, what arises is already safer than what we've buried. The emotional repression produces our suffering. So the suffering is, the story of I'm not good enough is safer than feeling and expressing anger to my loved ones. Being that limited self is safer, and we get love that way. By holding anger back, the conditioning says, or holding sadness back, the conditioning says. So identifying with these things are safer. So if we go to process, our nervous system wants to take us to things that are safer, especially if you can get relief that way through processing. So again, there's a first dimension way of just letting things be as they are. Don't process anything. Don't prompt anything up. And then there's a second dimension way that says, prompt things up, allow everything, but prompt things up and process those things that you prompt up. Remember that we're talking about dimensions now. This is an older thing that you should know about with KI. If you come here to correct suffering or bypass where your suffering didn't end and you're still suffering, this is something you want to know. Because your first dimension practices, speaking of the criticism, is where you don't prompt anything up, you don't use inquiry. It's all safer than what you've buried. So the repression is almost guaranteed, except for a few individuals who have this awakening, sudden, full embodiment experience. Very few individuals ever have that. And you're not going to be one of them, probably. That there's an unconsciousness here that will remain buried and missing the whole time you're doing practices like that, or just allowing things to be, first dimension. when you start prompting things up, which is second dimension, means prompting something up into awareness that wouldn't otherwise arise. That's why we call it second dimension. That's what we call second dimension. That too will be run by the nervous system if we don't get to the repression. See, remember, our option that we're choosing is to process but get to the repression. That's our work. But many of us are out there processing things that arise that are safer than the buried emotion, than the repression. See that? And that's our nervous system running that. It's just so innocent. Nobody's doing anything wrong. Don't feel judged. And if you do, process it, but get to the root, which is the repression. But if you understand what's happening, we're just trying to stay safe. That's an unconscious operating system. You pick up a spiritual practice, what your first intention might be from an unconscious level is to feel safe. So if you're suffering, if you can use a process to make yourself feel better, more expansive, more at peace, you'll do it. And your nervous system will reward you for that. And you will feel better, perhaps, or more at peace. And you'll come and do it again, perhaps. And that's how we get hooked into a bypass. Because you can take a process, and if you don't know where your suffering is coming from, you can target something in awareness that you can feel better by processing it. But those are just the effects of the repression that you're processing. So there, what you're doing is unconsciously creating it and processing what you created to feel better, to make your suffering feel better. So you create your suffering and then make it feel better, or feel more at peace with it, or just the effects of the repression. This is why I want you to narrow your option to this. And I'm becoming technical because the bypass has us by the you know what. It has us, many of us. Until I break this down for people, I want you to see the option of if you're unconsciously creating the suffering, then when it comes into awareness, bring it back to the root. Otherwise, you are probably processing just to make yourself feel better or more at peace. People will say, why do we do any processing around suffering? Why don't we just use processes to recognize that we are the awareness to which it all comes and goes? Because that's first dimension, and it misses the repression that doesn't arise. And so suffering tends to keep coming and going for people. That's the bypass. So there we're back to that, see? And then, of course, the nervous system will come up and say, well, why don't we just ask a few really important questions? And if I pull something up and I feel a lot of pain with it and I rest with it and allow it and I feel more presence, isn't that good? No. Yes, it cleared away some suffering that you conjured up. But do you know why you're able to conjure up such suffering in the first place? What you're holding at the unconscious level that allows you to prompt something like that up in the first place. And why would you want to use a process just to feel better or deal with something that you're creating at the unconscious level but you're not aware of doing it? If you're going to process, get to the root. And I think that might be the only answer from a deep transformative perspective, because I've looked at all this and when I've looked at all my options, they just led to missing the anger repression until I saw the option was to get to the root. Y'all, I tried everything I could to not go there. I tried every other option. I lived in that first dimension practice and realization for a while. The repression never got touched. The chronic pain and other things continued. Second dimension, I started to prompt some things up, but my nervous system would not take me to the repression. It was seeking safety, so I processed some stuff and I felt more open and even more embodied, but I didn't get to the root of the suffering. So I tried that, but then I went to third dimension. I finally got to the root of suffering. But also with these options that I mentioned. In other words, I didn't even know that I was unconsciously creating the suffering. So when I first came to these presence practices and teachings, I heard what you hear, which is, okay, allow it, because trying to get rid of it, changing it, neutralizing it, doing something with it, just makes it worse. But what I didn't understand in the beginning is because I'm creating that. So it's also circular and very resistant to be creating suffering and then just trying to change that. See? And that's what I say about processing. Why create suffering and then just process to try to change it and feel better? So there is a wisdom in the teachings or practices that say, just allow it, let it be. But it doesn't go deep enough to get to the root of why it's coming up in the first place. And that's why I couldn't take any of those options in the end. If I wanted to end suffering, I couldn't. The only option was, again, if I'm unconsciously creating this and I'm going to process this, I'm going to get to the root of it. And then what I learned was this, which is even more valuable. Well, valuable for me at least. I think a lot of people do this. This might be more a criticism of just how people interpret the teachings. A lot of the teachers don't intend the bypass to be like this. I didn't intend this, but it's just how we approach the subject and present it, and we don't embody it. And we might teach too early before it's embodied, and then sending everybody on a wild goose chase, really. Inadvertently, but still, we know not what we do, but still. Just understand the difference between nervous system regulation and either recognizing what you are and getting to the root of suffering. Those things are different. Recognizing that you are the presence, that's the ground of everything, and then getting to the root of suffering is very different than using spiritual practices to feel better, or because that can get you into a loop, right? Of then training yourself to miss and continue bypassing. But what I really learned that I want to share with you before I go is something that took me a long, long time to see, which is that a lot of people use self-inquiry and meditation once they don't get their needs met. But they don't maybe think of it that way, because this all comes from repression. Like I said in the approval seeking podcast, if I have to hold back an emotion, right there is the seeking of approval or to get attention or love. I can't be myself, so I look for that outside myself because I can't feel and express what's true for me. But I might not know about it because it's the missing experience. What I learned is that we quite naturally then, we don't realize that we have repression and we have unmet needs, if you want to just language it that way for a moment, which means we're seeking love, approval, validation, enlightenment, whatever. We're looking for something. And a lot of us approach spirituality from the suffering standpoint. In other words, one way to see it is like when I don't get my needs met, I suffer. But we don't look at it from where are these unmet needs coming from? And what if I learn where they're coming from and I make that conscious so I don't have those unmet needs, or I'm meeting those needs myself by allowing it all finally? That is different, but I could never teach in that way because I had the repression. So I couldn't say to people what I'm saying now, which is, if you approach spirituality or spiritual practice from the standpoint of you're trying to end the suffering, like you're only kind of meditating when things get bad, or you're triggered and then you're doing inquiry, that kind of thing, or like when your life is going good, you don't do a lot of processing, but when life goes bad, then you want to go, that right there misses the target, because it's these unmet needs. When you feel like your needs are met from outside of you, you easily ignore the repression that drives everything. And then when someone doesn't agree with that, or you don't get your needs met, or you don't get approval or love or something, then you suffer, and then you look for spiritual practice. I did too. It was the suffering that led me here. But if that's all that we're about, we can get hooked into like a really lifelong, bypass, which is not seeing that in every moment we're generating our own suffering. So we're going around in the world trying to get our needs met, but we're not aware of it. That's the missing experience. Repression is driving us everywhere we go. And what I didn't understand is I needed to process how I was actually interacting in my world with people. I needed to bring inquiry to that. repression inquiry because I was doing that with everybody. And then once I did it and I could experience that freedom and authenticity, I didn't have to do it with everything anymore. But for a while I did, because most of my spiritual practice was trying to kind of avoid that and kind of sit over here in awareness and have a recognition that I thought I could carry there into relationship, like you carry around insurance in a way. Like I did my work. I've had the recognition. I should just be able to be with what is now, no matter what happens. Like, I've got my insurance. I got it in my back pocket here, my spiritual resume and my shifts and everything. So shouldn't be any suffering in my relationships, right? But that didn't work out like that. So what I learned is that I had to reorient myself to what I think spiritual practice is, which is we're making the unconscious conscious. We're discovering what we are, this awareness. But we have to make this unconscious conscious in our lives and in our relationship, because that's where our unconsciousness is, in our relationships. Inquiry has to be brought there for a while, pretty like in a very devotional way, because that's our freedom. That once we start to see that, wow, we're missing the root of suffering, but now we can get to it in all those areas of suffering. We actually want to do that. I mean, we resist it. Yes, we totally do. But there's something in us that knows, once we connect the dots here, that this is a pathway to end suffering. We know it. We resist it, but we know it. And I think what changes for people who really do end their suffering here, or really find phenomenal benefit, is that they too see that they don't wait around for just getting triggered or they're having a bad day to come to KI or do work. They're much more earnest about it. And they see that the moment that they walk into a room, they know that it's operating. They know. Because they've done enough work to know it. And so they know, and in fact, they process in their life. So they know that about themselves when they walk in and do anything with anyone in any relationship, and they're open to processing how they relate to people, because they know that that's where the unconsciousness is. So they don't wait. See that? They don't say, oh, I'm doing well today, so I don't process, because they know that the conditioning is right there just waiting to make you suffer the next day. It's not sustainable. These momentary reprieves from suffering that we may get, even from processing, they aren't sustainable in the end. Chronic pain remains chronic. Body contraction remains. Depression may remain. In the end, whether there's suffering, like I say Monday in the podcast, it's your best indicator. And so now I'll invite you to listen to Monday's podcast, which is all your suffering is connected to one thing. And in the meantime, if you haven't started the path, you can start by taking the free repression test at Kiloby.com. Scroll to the bottom of the page. Or you can, I'm going to put the link to that free repression test right here in the description for this podcast. Also, the link to our May retreat is going to be right here in the podcast description. It's the first time we're bringing this 3D repression inquiry to the public. I've been talking about it a lot. We do it in the members area a lot, but that's behind closed doors in a way, and now there's an online 3-day retreat. You can join that. You'll hear me Monday, maybe.